There's a house in Iowa, a small white house on a quiet street corner, in a town so small you'd miss it if you blinked while driving through. From the outside it looks ordinary, peaceful even. The kind of place where families raise children and neighbors wave to each other from their porches. But if you knew what happened inside that house on a June night in 1912, you'd never see it the same way again. 8 people went to sleep in that house. 6 of them were children. By morning, all 8 were dead, their skulls shattered by an axe, their faces rendered unrecognizable, their blood soaking into the floorboards. No one heard them scream. No one saw the killer enter or leave. And more than a century later, no one knows for certain who wielded that axe. This is the story of the Villisca axe murders, one of America's most brutal unsolved crimes. A night of unthinkable horror in a place where horror had no business being. A mystery that spawned decades of investigations, trials, accusations, and theories, yet never yielded justice. Tonight, we're going back to 1912, back to that small Iowa town, back to the Moore family home where something evil walked through an unlocked door and changed a community forever. Prologue. A town called Villisca. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Villisca, you need to understand what Villisca was. In 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was a thriving small town in the southwestern corner of the state, about 10 miles from the Missouri border. Population, roughly 2,500 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where you couldn't walk down Main Street without exchanging greetings with a dozen neighbors. The town's name came from a Native American word, either from the Sac and Fox language meaning pretty place, or possibly from another dialect meaning lovely view. Some historians have noted with dark irony that it may have been confused with Villisca, which means evil place. The town was established in 1858, and by the early 1900s it had become a prosperous farming community. Villisca had what every small Midwestern town aspired to: thriving businesses, good schools, active churches, and that particular quality of safety that comes from knowing your neighbors and trusting them. Nearly 30 trains pass through Villisca every day, connecting it to the wider world. The town had its own National Guard armory, funded entirely by local residents, a source of immense civic pride. There were shops, restaurants, hotels, and implement dealerships selling farm equipment to the surrounding agricultural community. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, where children played outside until dark without supervision, where the worst crimes were petty theft or public drunkenness, where the idea of murder, especially the murder of children, was unthinkable. The Moore family embodied everything Villisca valued. Josiah B. Moore, known as Joe to friends and family, was born in 1868. By 1912, he was 43 years old and one of Villisca's most successful businessmen. He'd worked for years as a top salesman for Frank Jones, who owned one of the town's largest farm implement stores. In 1907, Joe left Jones's employ and opened his own competing hardware and implement business. It was a bold move that paid off. Joe secured the coveted John Deere dealership for his store, and his business thrived. He was ambitious, hardworking, and well-respected. People liked doing business with Joe Moore. On December 6, 1899, Joe married Sarah Montgomery at her parents' home. Sarah was born in 1873, making her 39 years old in 1912. She was a devoted wife, an active member of the Presbyterian Church, and a pillar of the community. She played piano for the church and regularly organized community events. Together, Joe and Sarah had 4 children. Herman Montgomery Moore, born in 1900 and 11 years old in 1912. Mary Catherine Moore, born in 1902 and 10 years old. Arthur Boyd Moore, born in 1905 and 7 years old. And Paul Vernon Moore, born in 1907 and just 5 years old. The Moore family lived in a modest 2-story white house at 508 East 2nd Street on the corner of 2nd and Villisca Avenue. It wasn't an ostentatious home, but it was comfortable. 6 rooms, well maintained, with a small front porch and a white picket fence. The Moores were, by all accounts, a happy family. The children were well behaved, polite, and regularly attended school and church. Joe was generous with his time and money, helping neighbors when they needed it. Sarah was kind and welcoming, the type of person who'd invite you in for coffee and make you feel at home. Everyone in Villisca knew the Moores, and everyone liked them. There was absolutely no reason anyone would want to harm this family. But on the night of June 9th, 1912, someone did. Part 1. Children's Day. Sunday, June 9th, 1912, was a beautiful summer day in Villisca. Warm but not oppressively hot. The kind of day perfect for church services and community gatherings. That evening, the town's Presbyterian Church held its annual Children's Day program, a special service celebrating the young members of the congregation. It was a big event in Villisca's social calendar. Families dressed in their Sunday best. Children had been rehearsing songs and recitations for weeks. Sarah Moore had coordinated much of the program. Her children were excited to participate. Also participating were 2 sisters from outside town, Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Ina May Stillinger, age 8. The Stillinger girls lived on a large farm about 7 miles outside Villisca with their parents and older siblings. They were friends with the Moore children, especially with Mary Catherine Moore, who was 10. The church service began around 8 p.m. and ran longer than expected. The program was elaborate. Songs, prayers, recitations, and performances by the children. The church was packed with proud parents and community members. The service didn't end until around 9:30 p.m. By the time people began leaving the church, the sun had set. The streets of Villisca were dark. The town had streetlights, but they were turned off at night to save money. Walking home meant navigating in near total darkness. The Stillinger girls' family lived 7 miles out of town. Their older sister Blanche had accompanied them to the service, but getting home would mean either walking in complete darkness or arranging for someone with a wagon to take them. Catherine Moore had a better idea. She asked her parents if Lena and Ina could stay overnight at the Moore house. The girls were friends. It made sense. It was convenient. Joe Moore called the Stillinger home and spoke with someone there. Accounts vary on whether it was Blanche or another family member. Permission was granted. The girls could stay over. It was an innocent decision, a simple sleepover between friends. It would save their lives, or so everyone thought. Actually, it would doom them. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters walked home from church together. It was only about 5 blocks, a short walk through the quiet streets of Villisca. They arrived at the Moore house sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. Inside, everyone prepared for bed. The children changed into their night clothes. Sarah might have laid out some light refreshments. The house settled into its nighttime routine. The layout of the house is important to understand what would happen next. The first floor contained the living room, dining room, kitchen, and a guest bedroom. This guest bedroom was where Lena and Ina Stillinger would sleep that night, on a bed in the downstairs parlor area. The second floor had 2 bedrooms. One was the master bedroom where Joe and Sarah slept. The other was the children's bedroom where Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul all slept together. 2 boys in one bed, 2 children in another. The house had been built in the late 1800s. The floors were original hardwood. The stairs were wooden and creaked when you walked on them. Every footstep echoed through the quiet house. By sometime around 10 o'clock or 10:30 p.m., everyone was in bed. 8 people, 6 children and 2 adults, all asleep or settling into sleep in a house with an unlocked door. In 1912 Villisca, nobody locked their doors. There was no reason to. This was a safe town, a good town. Somewhere between midnight and 5 o'clock a.m., most experts believe around midnight to 2 o'clock a.m., someone entered the Moore house. They didn't break in. They simply opened the unlocked door and walked inside. They knew the layout of the house. They moved with purpose. They brought an oil lamp with them, or found one inside and turned it down very low, just enough light to see but not enough to wake anyone. And they brought an axe. Or perhaps they didn't bring one. Perhaps they found Joe Moore's axe, kept in the backyard for chopping wood, and carried it inside with them. Either way, they climbed those creaking wooden stairs to the second floor, and they began killing. Part 2. The Murders. What happened in the Moore house between midnight and dawn would later be pieced together by investigators examining the crime scene and the victims' bodies. It's a reconstruction. No one witnessed it. No one survived it. But the physical evidence tells a story, a horrifying one. The killer went to the master bedroom first. Joe Moore was asleep in bed with his wife Sarah. The room was dark except for whatever dim light the killer carried. The killer approached Joe's side of the bed, raised the axe, and struck. The ceiling above Joe's bed would later show gouge marks, evidence of how violently the killer swung the weapon. The force was tremendous. The first blow likely killed or incapacitated Joe instantly. But the killer didn't stop with one blow. Joe Moore received more blows than any other victim. His face was struck so many times it was rendered completely unrecognizable. His eyes were gone, destroyed by the force of the axe. Investigators would later count approximately 30 separate impacts to his head and upper body. It was overkill, rage, or perhaps a message. Sarah Moore died next. She was in the same bed, possibly waking to the sound of her husband being murdered beside her. The killer used the blade of the axe on Sarah, the only victim who would be struck with the sharp edge rather than the blunt end. She died in her bed beside her husband, unable to save him or herself. The killer then moved to the adjacent bedroom where the 4 more children slept. Herman, age 11, Mary Catherine, age 10, Arthur, age 7, Paul, age 5. They were asleep. There's no evidence they woke up. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. The killer moved methodically from child to child, striking each in the head with the blunt end of the axe. The blows were powerful enough to crush their skulls. The ceiling in this room also bore gouge marks from the upswing of the weapon. 4 children, murdered in their sleep, their blood soaking into their bedding, pooling on the floor. And then the killer did something strange. He went back to the master bedroom. Joe and Sarah Moore were already dead, their bodies already brutalized. But the killer returned and struck them again. More blows, more violence, as if the initial attack hadn't been enough. A shoe that had been sitting on the floor, filled with blood from Joe's wounds. The killer knocked it over during this second assault. Why return to the master bedroom? Why attack already dead bodies? No one knows. Then the killer went back downstairs. Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping in the first floor guest bedroom. They were the last to die, or at least the killer murdered them last in his progression through the house. But here, something different happened. Lena Stillinger may have been awake. Her body was found lying crosswise on the bed rather than lengthwise, suggesting she'd been moving, trying to get up or get away. She had what appeared to be a defensive wound on her arm, an injury consistent with raising her hand to protect herself. Her nightgown had been pushed up, and she'd been left partially exposed. Doctors who examined her body would later conclude she had not been sexually assaulted, but the positioning was disturbing nonetheless. There was a blood stain on her knee. Her body had been moved. Ina, the younger sister, appeared to have died in her sleep beside Lena. The murder weapon, Joe Moore's own axe, was left in the Stillinger girls' bedroom, lying near their bed. And then the killer did something even stranger. He stayed in the house. Physical evidence would later show that the killer spent considerable time in the house after the murders. He covered all the windows, every single one. He hung clothing, skirts, aprons over the windows in the second-floor bedrooms. He used sheets and fabric to cover the first-floor windows. It must have taken him significant time to do this throughout the entire house. Why? To prevent anyone from looking in and discovering the bodies. to create darkness for some ritual purpose, to buy himself time to leave town unseen. He covered all the mirrors in the house with cloth. This was a Victorian funeral custom. When someone died, mirrors were covered during wakes and mourning periods. The superstition was that mirrors could trap a person's soul, or that seeing your reflection while a corpse was in the house was bad luck. Did the killer know this custom? Was he mimicking the rituals of death, or was it coincidence? He placed pieces of cloth or clothing over each victim's face. He went to the kitchen and took a 4-pound slab of raw bacon from the icebox. He laid it on the floor next to the axe. Investigators would find it there the next morning, unexplained. He may have tried to wash himself. There was evidence of bloody water in the kitchen. Cigarette butts were found in the attic, suggesting someone had been up there, either waiting before the attacks or hiding afterward. And then, sometime before dawn, the killer left. He walked out of the house the same way he'd entered, through the unlocked door. He left it locked behind him, which would puzzle investigators. How had he locked it from the outside? By the time the sun rose over Villisca on the morning of June 10th, 1912, the killer was gone. 8 people lay dead in the Moore house, and no one knew. Part 3. Discovery. Mary Peckham had been the Moores' neighbor for years. She lived next door and knew their routines well. Every morning the Moore household was up early. Joe would be out tending to his horses and chickens. The children would be preparing for school. There was always activity, noise, movement, the sounds of a busy family starting their day. On Monday morning, June 10th, 1912, Mary Peckham noticed something was wrong. She'd been up since 5 a.m. as she usually was. She went outside around 6 a.m. to hang laundry. The Moore house was silent, completely silent. By 7 a.m. she was concerned. The chickens hadn't been let out. The horses hadn't been fed. She could see they were restless in their stalls. The children should have been up by now, getting ready for school. The house was locked up tight, all the curtains and blinds closed. Not a sound came from inside. Mary walked over and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked louder. Still nothing. She tried both the front and back doors, both locked. She looked in the windows but couldn't see anything through the closed curtains. Something was very wrong. Mary went back to her house and made some phone calls. She tried reaching Joe at his store. No answer. She called Joe's father. He wasn't there either. Finally, around 8 a.m., she got hold of Ross Moore, Joe's older brother. "Ross, you need to come to your brother's house," she told him. "Something's wrong. Nobody's awake and nobody's answering." Ross Moore lived nearby. He arrived at the house around 8:15 a.m. Like Mary, he knocked on the doors and got no response. He shouted his brother's name. Nothing. Ross had a key to the house. He unlocked the front door. Mary Peckham stayed on the porch. Ross went inside alone. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The house was dim, all the curtains were drawn, but it seemed orderly. Then he noticed the smell, copper, blood, something wrong in the air. He walked toward the first-floor bedroom, the guest room where he assumed the Stillinger girls had slept. He opened the door, and there, in the dim light filtering through covered windows, he saw them. Lena and Ina Stillinger, in bed, covered with sheets, but something was wrong with the shapes under those sheets, and there was blood. So much blood. Ross Moore ran out of the house. "Call the marshal," he shouted to Mary Peckham. "Call everyone. Something terrible has happened." One of Joe's employees, Ed Seeley, arrived just then to do the morning chores. Ross told him not to bother. "Something terrible has happened here," he said again. Mary Peckham called the town's marshal, Henry Hank Horton, and she called the town's central telephone operator, who at 8:40 a.m. issued an all-call alert, a message sent to every phone in Villisca. 8 people had been murdered at the Moore house. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Villisca was a small town. News traveled faster than fire. By the time Marshal Horton arrived at the Moore house shortly before 9 a.m., a crowd had already gathered. Horton entered the house with Ross Moore. They went room by room. The Stillinger girls in the downstairs bedroom, dead. Up the stairs to the second floor. The children's bedroom, 4 small bodies, dead. The master bedroom, Joe and Sarah Moore, dead. Blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceilings, pooled on the floors, the smell overwhelming. Marshal Horton, a small-town lawman who'd probably never worked a murder case in his life, was completely overwhelmed. And then he made a catastrophic mistake. He let people into the house. Not just police or officials, regular townspeople, curious neighbors, friends of the family. Within an hour, more than 100 people had tramped through the crime scene. They walked through the rooms. They touched things. Some people picked up the murder weapon, the bloody axe, and handled it. Evidence was contaminated. Fingerprints, not that anyone could properly lift them in 1912, were destroyed or overlaid with dozens of other prints. Some townspeople even took pieces of Joe Moore's skull as souvenirs. It was a catastrophic failure of crime scene preservation that would haunt the investigation forever. Dr. J. Clark Cooper arrived and pronounced all 8 victims dead. He estimated they'd been killed sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. Local investigator Henry Lee Lindquist, who had some experience with crime scenes, was appalled by the chaos. He urged the sheriff to call in the National Guard to secure the scene. Fortunately, Villisca had its own National Guard armory. By 10:30 a.m., guardsmen had arrived and established a perimeter around the house, finally stopping the flow of gawkers and souvenir hunters. But the damage was done. Any chance of processing the scene properly, of finding fingerprints, tracking footprints, preserving blood spatter patterns, was gone, trampled underfoot by 100 curious townspeople. The bodies remained in the house all day. It wasn't until after 10 p.m. that night that the undertaker was finally given permission to remove them. They were transported to the fire station, which had been set up as a temporary morgue. Autopsies were performed. The findings were grim but straightforward. All 8 victims had died from blunt force trauma to the head, multiple skull fractures, massive brain injuries. Josiah Moore had approximately 30 separate wound sites. His face had been obliterated. Sarah Moore had been struck with the blade of the axe, the only victim killed with the sharp edge rather than the blunt end. The 4 children each had multiple skull fractures. All appeared to have been asleep when struck. Lena Stillinger had a possible defensive wound, suggesting she may have been partially awake. Her body showed signs of having been moved. Ina Stillinger appeared to have died in her sleep. Estimated time of death between midnight and 5 a.m. on June 10th, 1912. The funerals were held on June 12th, 1912, just 2 days after the discovery. The town's square couldn't accommodate the crowds. Thousands attended. The funeral procession was 50 carriages long. National Guardsmen blocked the streets. 8 caskets, 6 of them heartbreakingly small. The Moore family was buried together in Villisca Cemetery. The Stillinger girls were buried in separate plots, and the investigation began in earnest. Though by then, with the crime scene destroyed, it was already too late. Part 4. The Investigation. The Villisca axe murders were front-page news across the country. In Iowa, they knocked even the Titanic disaster from the headlines. Every newspaper in America wanted updates. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Marshal Hank Horton was hopelessly out of his depth. This was Villisca. They dealt with drunk and disorderly conduct, not octuple homicides. The state sent investigators. Private detective agencies were hired. The Burns Detective Agency out of Kansas City got involved. Everyone wanted to solve the case, but the destroyed crime scene made everything harder. Still, investigators did their best to reconstruct what happened. The axe used in the killings belonged to Joe Moore. It had been kept in the backyard for chopping wood. The killer had either brought it into the house or found it there and used it. Blood was everywhere, but there were strange patterns. The killer must have been covered in blood, yet there were no bloody footprints leading out of the house. Had he cleaned himself before leaving? The covered windows, the covered mirrors, the cloth placed over the victims' faces. These ritualistic elements suggested someone with specific intentions or beliefs. The slab of raw bacon left on the floor next to the axe baffled everyone. What did it mean? Was it significant or just random? Cigarette butts in the attic suggested someone may have been hiding up there, either before or after the murders. Had the killer waited in the attic for the family to fall asleep before descending to kill them? The door had been locked when Mary Peckham tried it in the morning. How had the killer locked it from the outside? Or had someone locked it from inside after the murders and then left through a window? Investigators canvassed the area. Had anyone seen strangers in town that night? Had anyone heard screams? One neighbor would later testify to hearing a sound around midnight, possibly a scream or a shout, but thought nothing of it at the time. In a town with trains running all night and various noises, it was easy to dismiss. No one reported seeing anyone entering or leaving the Moore house. The killer had come and gone like a ghost. Within days, investigators had their first suspects. In the immediate aftermath, every stranger in Villisca was considered suspect. Traveling salesmen, hobos riding the trains, anyone who couldn't account for their whereabouts that night. One early suspect was Andrew Sawyer, a transient worker who'd been in the area. When questioned, Sawyer admitted he was obsessed with the murders. He slept fully clothed, as if ready to flee at any moment. He slept with an axe by his bed. Suspicious? Absolutely. But investigators couldn't tie him to the crime. Sarah Moore's brother-in-law, Lee Van Gilder, was briefly considered. He was prone to violence, had previous run-ins with the law, and there was bad blood between him and the family. But his alibi checked out. Then investigators started looking at motive. Who would want Joe Moore and his family dead? And one name kept coming up: Frank F. Jones. Part 5. The Suspects. Frank Fernando Jones was one of Villisca's most prominent citizens, a successful businessman, an Iowa state senator, well-connected, wealthy, respected, and he hated Joe Moore. Joe had worked for Frank Jones for years, serving as a top salesman at Jones's farm implement business. Joe was good at his job. Very good. He made Jones a lot of money. But in 1907, Joe left to start his own competing business. And when he did, he took the lucrative John Deere dealership with him. In a small town like Villisca, this was a massive betrayal. The John Deere franchise was worth thousands of dollars. Losing it cost Jones significantly. The two men became bitter enemies. By 1910, they wouldn't speak to each other. They crossed the street to avoid meeting. The animosity was well known throughout the town. But business rivalry alone wasn't enough to explain murder, especially the murder of an entire family, including 4 children. There was another rumor, though investigators could never prove it. Some people whispered that Joe Moore had been having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna Jones. True or not, the rumor spread, and it gave Frank Jones an additional motive, not just business revenge, but personal humiliation. But Frank Jones was a prominent politician and businessman. Would he really commit murder? Would he really butcher an entire family with an axe? Most investigators didn't think so, but they thought he might have hired someone to do it. Enter William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was an ex-convict and former U.S. Army soldier who'd been stationed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He had a criminal record. His fingerprints were on file at the federal penitentiary. He also had connections to a series of eerily similar axe murders across the Midwest. 9 months before Villisca, in September 1911, a family in Colorado Springs, Colorado, had been murdered with an axe. The crime scene bore striking similarities to Villisca. Windows covered with sheets, victims bludgeoned in their beds, the killer spending time in the house after the murders. 4 days before Villisca, on June 5, 1912, axe murders occurred in Paola, Kansas. Same methodology, same ritual elements. And 2 years after Villisca, in July 1914, William Mansfield's own wife, infant child, and in-laws were murdered with an axe in Blue Island, Illinois. Either Mansfield was the unluckiest man alive, or he was a serial killer. Detective James Newton Wilkerson of the Burns Detective Agency became convinced that Frank Jones had hired William Mansfield to kill the Moore family. Wilkerson was relentless. He investigated obsessively. He built a case. He held public meetings in Villisca, standing on a car and shouting to crowds that he had proof, documents that would convict Mansfield and prove Jones had paid for it. In 1916, 4 years after the murders, Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County, Iowa, to face a grand jury. The town waited for justice. But then Mansfield produced an alibi. Payroll records showed he'd been working hundreds of miles away in Illinois on the night of the Villisca murders. He couldn't have been in Iowa. The grand jury refused to indict him. Mansfield was released. Villisca was shocked. Detective Wilkerson was furious. He publicly accused Frank Jones of using his political influence to manipulate the grand jury, to protect himself and Mansfield. Jones sued Wilkerson for slander, demanding $60,000 in damages. The lawsuit dragged on. Eventually, Jones won, and Wilkerson had to pay court costs. But many Villisca residents never believed the verdict. They remained convinced that Jones was guilty and had bought his way out of justice. Frank Jones's political career was destroyed. He lost his Senate seat. His reputation was permanently tarnished, even though he was never charged with any crime. But if Mansfield didn't do it, and Jones didn't hire him, who killed the Moore family? Part 6. Reverend Kelly. Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly was not someone you'd immediately suspect of being capable of murder. He was tiny, just 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighing 119 pounds, meek, nervous, a traveling Presbyterian minister from England who'd settled in Macedonia, Iowa with his wife. But George Kelly was also deeply troubled. He'd reportedly suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he'd been accused multiple times of peeping into windows, watching women and girls undress. He'd asked young women and girls to pose nude for him. He was, in the parlance of the time, peculiar. And he'd been in Villisca on the night of the murders. Kelly had arrived in Villisca on June 8, 1912, to help with the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. He was there on June 9th when the service was held. He attended the program. He saw the Moore family. He saw the Stillinger girls perform. And then on the morning of June 10th, he left Villisca on the 5:19 a.m. westbound train, hours before the bodies were discovered. According to some witnesses, Kelly told fellow travelers on that train that there were 8 dead souls back in Villisca. How would he know that, unless he'd been there when they died? But it gets stranger. In the weeks and months after the murders, Kelly became obsessed with the case. He wrote dozens of letters to police, investigators, and family members of the victims. Long, rambling letters full of details about the crime, some details only the killer would know, or details he'd read in newspapers. Kelly arranged to return to Villisca 2 weeks after the murders. He wanted to see the house. He wanted to walk through the crime scene. Investigators found this behavior deeply suspicious. Was Kelly confessing through his letters? Was he haunted by guilt? Or was he just a disturbed man fixated on a sensational crime? Detective Wilkerson communicated with Kelly, asking him pointed questions about the murders. Kelly replied with more detailed letters, describing sounds he claimed to have heard, things he might have seen. But Kelly's mental state made it hard to know what was real. Did he know these things because he committed the murders? Or because he'd imagined them so vividly that his fantasies became indistinguishable from memory? Blood spatters in the Moore house indicated the killer was left-handed. George Kelly was left-handed. A dry cleaner in a nearby town reported that Kelly had brought in bloody clothing a few days after the murders. Kelly had reportedly asked police for permission to enter the house, posing as a Scotland Yard detective. And then, after hours of intense interrogation by police in 1917, Kelly confessed. He said he'd committed the murders. He described entering the house, climbing the stairs, killing the family. He claimed God had commanded him to do it, that he'd been studying a sermon on slay utterly and felt an overwhelming compulsion. Investigators finally had their man. Or did they? George Kelly was arrested and charged with murder in 1917, 5 years after the crime. He was tried twice. The first trial in September 1917 ended in a hung jury. The jury couldn't agree on whether Kelly was guilty. The second trial in November 1917 ended in an acquittal. The jury simply didn't believe his confession. Kelly recanted, saying the police had coerced him. He'd been interrogated for hours. He was tired, confused, mentally unstable. He'd told them what they wanted to hear. And there were problems with his confession. Some details didn't match the crime scene. His physical stature made it hard to believe he could have overpowered and killed 8 people. His meek personality didn't fit the profile of someone capable of such brutal violence. The jury decided he was innocent. George Kelly walked free. By then, it was 1917. 5 years had passed since the murders. No one had been convicted. The case was effectively dead. Villisca was left with no answers, no justice, and a growing sense that they'd never know who killed the Moore family. Part 7. The Serial Killer Theory. But what if the Villisca murders weren't an isolated incident? What if they were part of something bigger, a pattern of killings across the Midwest committed by a single killer? This theory gained traction over the years as investigators began connecting the dots between multiple axe murders that occurred between 1911 and 1912. The similarities were impossible to ignore. September 17, 1911. Colorado Springs, Colorado. The Wayne family was murdered in their home. The father, mother, and their daughter were killed with an axe while they slept. The crime scene bore remarkable similarities to what would later happen in Villisca. Victims killed in their beds, windows covered with cloth, the killer spending time in the house after the murders. October 15th, 1911, Monmouth, Illinois. William Dawson and his wife were bludgeoned to death in their beds with an axe. Again, similar patterns: sleeping victims, brutal head trauma, methodical killing. June 5, 1912, Paola, Kansas. Just 4 days before Villisca, the Dawson family, Rollin, Anna, and their 3 children, were murdered with an axe. The crime scene methodology was nearly identical to Villisca: windows covered, victims in their beds, the killer taking time in the house afterward. June 10, 1912, Villisca, Iowa. The Moore family and Stillinger sisters, 8 victims, the most brutal of the series. September 30th, 1912, Monmouth, Illinois. The Pfanschmidt family, 4 victims, murdered with a blunt instrument. The house was set on fire afterward, possibly to destroy evidence. October 15th, 1912, Columbia, Missouri. The Showman family, mother, father, and 3 children, killed with an axe in their beds. Windows covered, ritualistic elements present. The geographic spread of these murders followed train routes across Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois. In 1911 and 1912, thousands of transient workers, drifters, and traveling laborers rode the rails looking for work. A killer could commit a murder in one town, hop a train that same night, and be hundreds of miles away by morning. This theory suggested a serial killer, possibly a railroad worker or hobo, who traveled from town to town, selecting families at random, killing them in their sleep, and then disappearing back into the anonymous flow of transient workers. The ritualistic elements, the covered windows, the covered mirrors, the time spent in the house, suggested someone with a specific compulsion or delusion. Perhaps religious mania, perhaps sexual pathology, perhaps just madness. Several investigators became convinced this was the answer. Not a personal vendetta against the Moore family, not Frank Jones's revenge plot, but a random act by a traveling madman who happened to be passing through Villisca on June 9, 1912. But if this was true, why did the murders stop after 1912? Some historians suggest the killer died, perhaps killed himself after the Villisca murders, which were the most brutal and may have represented some kind of psychological culmination. Perhaps he was arrested for an unrelated crime and imprisoned. Perhaps he moved to another region and continued killing under different methods that were never connected. Or perhaps the serial killer theory is just an attempt to impose pattern and meaning on what was actually several unrelated crimes. The truth is, we don't know. Part 8. Theories and Speculation. Over the past century, countless theories have emerged about who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. Let's examine the most compelling ones. Theory 1. Frank Jones hired a killer. This remains one of the strongest theories despite the lack of concrete evidence. Frank Jones had motive, business rivalry, personal animosity, possibly sexual jealousy. He had means, wealth and connections, and William Mansfield, with his criminal background and presence at similar murders, fit the profile of a hired killer. But Mansfield's alibi held up, and no evidence ever directly connected Jones to the crime. If Jones hired someone, he covered his tracks perfectly. The theory explains the personal nature of the attack on Joe Moore, the excessive violence, the 30 blows to his head, the return to his body for a second assault. That suggests rage and personal hatred, not random violence. But it doesn't explain why the children had to die, why the Stillinger girls, who weren't even supposed to be there, had to die. A professional killer would have killed Joe Moore and left. This was something more. Theory 2. Reverend Kelly. George Kelly confessed, which makes him a compelling suspect. He was in Villisca that night. He left on an early morning train. He knew details about the crime. He was mentally unstable and may have been capable of violence. But his confession was recanted and full of inconsistencies. His physical stature makes it hard to believe he could overpower and kill 8 people. 2 juries found him not guilty. If Kelly did it, why? What was his motive? Religious mania, sexual deviance directed at the Stillinger girls or Sarah Moore, pure insanity? The theory that he was obsessed with the children's program, perhaps fixated on one of the young girls, and committed the murders in some kind of delusional frenzy has its advocates, but it's impossible to prove. Theory 3. A serial killer. The pattern of similar axe murders across the Midwest suggests a traveling killer. The methodology: families killed in their sleep, windows covered, ritualistic elements, is too similar to be coincidence. This theory explains why no one in Villisca had motive to kill the Moores. It explains why the crime was so brutal and impersonal. It explains why no one saw a suspicious stranger. Transients passing through town were invisible, part of the background. But if this was a serial killer, his victims were seemingly random. Why the Moore house? Why that night? Pure chance? Or did the killer have some way of selecting targets? And why did similar murders stop after 1912? Did the killer die, get caught, move on to other methods? Theory 4. Someone with a personal grudge. Perhaps it wasn't Frank Jones, but someone else in Villisca who hated Joe Moore. A business competitor, someone who felt wronged, someone nursing a deep, hidden resentment. The problem with this theory is that Joe Moore was, by all accounts, well liked. He was generous, kind, helpful to neighbors. Who would hate him enough to slaughter his entire family? Unless the grudge wasn't about Joe at all. Theory 5. It was about Sarah Moore or the Stillinger girls. Some theories suggest the primary target wasn't Joe, but Sarah Moore or Lena Stillinger. Sarah was active in the community, played piano at church, knew everyone in town. Could she have been the target of someone's obsession or rage? Lena Stillinger's body showed signs of being moved and positioned. Her nightgown had been pushed up. The positioning suggested something sexual, even though doctors concluded she hadn't been assaulted. Could the murders have been committed by someone obsessed with Lena? This theory explains why the Stillinger girls, who weren't supposed to be there, died. If Lena was the primary target, the killer came to the Moore house specifically because she was staying there. But this requires the killer to have known Lena would be at the Moore house that night. The decision for her to stay over was made spontaneously after the church program. How would the killer have known? Unless he was at the church, watching, waiting. Theory 6. The killer lived in Villisca. This is perhaps the most disturbing theory, that the killer wasn't a stranger but someone who lived in Villisca. Someone the Moores knew and trusted. This explains how the killer knew the layout of the house, how he moved through it confidently in the dark, how he knew where the axe was kept in the backyard, how he disappeared afterward without being noticed because he simply went home, washed, and resumed his normal life. It explains why no stranger was reported in town, why no one saw anyone suspicious, because the killer was part of the community. But if this is true, it means someone in Villisca, perhaps someone who attended the funerals, who expressed grief and horror, was secretly a murderer. It means the killer lived among the survivors for the rest of his life, carrying the secret to his grave. The truth is, we may never know which theory is correct, or perhaps none of them are exactly right. Perhaps the real explanation is some combination of factors we haven't considered. What we do know is this. On June 10th, 1912, 8 people were murdered in their sleep in Villisca, Iowa. The killer was never caught. The crime was never solved. And more than a century later, the house still stands. Part 9. The House Today. If you drive through Villisca today, you'll find a quiet Iowa town of about 1,200 people, less than half its population in 1912. Main Street has fewer businesses. The trains still pass through, but they don't stop as often. And on the corner of East 2nd Street and Villisca Avenue, you'll find a small white house with a front porch. The Villisca Axe Murder House. It's been preserved almost exactly as it was on June 10th, 1912. The same wallpaper, the same layout, the same creaking stairs, even some of the same furniture that was there when the murders occurred. In 1994, Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased the house with the intention of preserving it as a historical site. Since then, it's been open for tours. People come from all over the country, all over the world, to see the place where one of America's most infamous unsolved murders occurred. You can walk through the rooms, stand in the guest bedroom where Lena and Ina Stillinger died, climb the stairs to the second floor, those same creaking wooden stairs the killer climbed, and enter the children's bedroom where Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul Moore were murdered in their sleep. You can see the gouge marks in the ceiling where the killer swung the axe so violently the backswing struck the plaster. You can stand in the master bedroom where Joe and Sarah Moore died. The house offers something else too, overnight stays. Yes, you can spend the night in the Villisca Axe Murder House, sleep in the same rooms where 8 people were killed, experience the darkness, the silence, the particular quality of isolation the house possesses. Thousands of people have done it. Ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, true crime enthusiasts, curiosity seekers, and people who just want to test their courage. Many report strange experiences, sounds that shouldn't be there, footsteps on the stairs when no one is walking, voices, shadows, a pervasive feeling of being watched. Are these genuine paranormal phenomena? The spirits of the Moore family and Stillinger sisters still trapped in the place where they died? Or are they the product of suggestion, expectation, and the power of the house's dark history to prey on our imaginations? The house has become a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by true crime. Some come with respect, seeking to understand the tragedy. Others come for thrills, to say they survived a night in one of America's most haunted houses. The town of Villisca has complicated feelings about this. For some residents, the house is an embarrassment, a reminder of the town's darkest moment, now commodified for entertainment. They wish people would let the past rest. For others, it's an important historical site, a way to remember the victims, a memorial to 8 lives lost to senseless violence. And for still others, it's a legitimate part of the town's economy. Tourism brings money. People who visit the house eat at local restaurants, shop at local stores, stay at local hotels. But everyone in Villisca knows the name Moore. Many current residents are descendants of people who were alive in 1912, who knew the family, who attended the funerals. The murders didn't just kill 8 people. They killed the town's innocence. They shattered the belief that small-town Iowa was safe from the worst kinds of evil. They created a wound that never fully healed. In Villisca Cemetery, on the eastern edge of town, you'll find the Moore family graves. 8 headstones in a row. Joe, Sarah, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul Moore, alongside Lena and Ina Stillinger. The stones are simple, names, dates, some worn by more than a century of Iowa weather. People still visit. They leave flowers, coins, small tokens of remembrance. On June 10th every year, the anniversary of the murders, there's usually a small gathering. Descendants of the family, townspeople, true crime researchers, people who want to remember, because that's what we owe them. The Moore family and the Stillinger girls weren't just victims in a famous unsolved case. They were real people. They had lives, dreams, futures that were stolen from them. Joe Moore was a successful businessman, a father, a husband, building a life in a town he loved. Sarah Moore was a devoted wife and mother, active in her church, known for her kindness. Herman, at 11, was on the verge of becoming a young man. He had his whole life ahead of him. Mary Catherine, 10 years old, was friends with Lena Stillinger. They probably stayed up late that night, giggling and talking the way young girls do at sleepovers. Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5, babies really, children who should have grown up to have their own families, their own children. Lena Stillinger, 12, who may have been awake when the killer came, who may have tried to fight back, who died in terror in a house that wasn't her own. And Ina Stillinger, 8 years old, the youngest victim. She died in her sleep beside her sister, never knowing what happened. They deserved justice. They deserved to be remembered as more than victims in an unsolved mystery. And they deserved the truth. But the truth died with the killer. Epilogue. the unanswered questions. More than 110 years have passed since the Villisca axe murders. Everyone who was alive that night is now dead. The investigators, the suspects, the townspeople who attended the funerals, even the children who were young in 1912 are gone now. The case is cold, officially unsolved. No one will ever be arrested. No one will ever stand trial. But the questions remain. Who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters? Was it Frank Jones's hired assassin? Reverend Kelly in a fit of religious mania? A serial killer passing through on the railroad? Someone in Villisca nursing a secret grudge? Why did the killer spend so much time in the house? Why cover the windows and mirrors? Why place the slab of bacon on the floor? Were these actions meaningful or random? Why were the Stillinger girls killed? They weren't supposed to be there. The decision for them to stay over was spontaneous. Did the killer come specifically because Lena was there? Or did he kill them simply because they were witnesses? What was the killer's relationship to the family? Was this personal, rage directed at Joe Moore specifically? Or was it random, a madman selecting a target by chance? And perhaps the most haunting question, did the killer feel remorse? Did he live with guilt for the rest of his life? Or did he feel nothing at all? The house on Swan Street in Washington, D.C., where Robert Wone died, holds its secrets. The house on Swan Street in Villisca holds different secrets, older ones buried deeper, guarded by more than a century of silence. But houses don't keep secrets, people do. And somewhere, in a grave in Iowa or Kansas or Illinois or some other state entirely, lies the person who knows exactly what happened on the night of June 9th, 1912. They took that knowledge with them when they died. And unless some new evidence emerges, a deathbed confession recorded and hidden away, a diary discovered in an attic, some artifact that definitively connects a suspect to the crime, we'll never know for certain. The Villisca axe murders remain one of America's most infamous cold cases, not because of the number of victims, though 8 deaths is horrific, not because of the brutality, though it was extreme, but because of the questions, the complete lack of resolution, the way the case defies every attempt to solve it. No matter how much evidence you examine, no matter how many suspects you consider, no matter how many theories you construct, you can't quite make the pieces fit. There's always something that doesn't make sense, always some detail that contradicts your conclusion. Always another possibility you haven't considered. It's a puzzle with missing pieces, a story with the ending torn out. And perhaps that's why, more than a century later, people are still fascinated, still investigating, still trying to solve what the original detectives, with all their resources and proximity to the crime, could never solve. Because we need answers, we need closure, we need to believe that evil can be understood, identified, punished. The Villisca axe murders remind us that sometimes evil simply walks away, unpunished, unknown, leaving only questions and ghosts in its wake. Some crimes are solved, Evidence accumulates, technology advances, someone confesses or makes a mistake. But some crimes remain forever locked in the past, beyond the reach of justice, beyond the reach of understanding. The Villisca axe murders are one of those crimes. On June 9, 1912, 8 people went to sleep in a small white house in Iowa. They never woke up, and the person who killed them, whether Frank Jones's hired killer, Reverend Kelly, a serial killer riding the rails, or someone else entirely, was never caught. Justice was never served. The families never received closure. The truth was never revealed. But we can remember. We can remember Josiah Joe Moore, Sarah Moore, Herman Moore, Mary Catherine Moore, Arthur Moore, Paul Moore, Lena Stillinger, and Ina Stillinger. We can remember that they weren't just names in a famous murder case. They were real people. They mattered. Their lives had value. And we can honor them by continuing to ask questions, to seek truth, to refuse to let their deaths be forgotten. The house in Villisca still stands. The cemetery still holds their graves. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the Iowa cornfields and the trains pass through town, some people say you can still feel the weight of that terrible night. A night when evil came to Villisca. A night that changed a town forever. A night that remains more than a century later, shrouded in mystery. If you find yourself in Iowa, you can visit the Villisca Axe Murder House. Walk through those rooms, stand where the victims died, feel the history of that place. But remember, you're walking through a grave, treated with respect. And if you're ever in Villisca Cemetery, stop by the Moore family graves. Leave a flower, say their names. Remember that they lived and that their deaths, though unsolved, still matter. Sometimes the only justice we can offer is remembrance. Sometimes the only answer we have is silence. Sleep well, if you can.